So if you want to turn to Job, let's see, I think we fairly well covered chapter 12. I want to bring up some points in chapter 13, and then especially chapter 14 before we move on, because there's a couple of kind of important points to make there that I don't want us to overlook. Before we get started, though, let's have a word of prayer. Our dearest Father in heaven, we thank you so much for the opportunity to open your word together, for the opportunity to study from your word and to gain the wisdom that's contained within it, and to learn from these examples that we see, the examples of Job and his life and his friends and how they spoke with Job. And Father, we ask that you would help us to gain knowledge and understanding, to gain wisdom, that we might be better prepared to be your servants, that we might have a better understanding heart when we're comforting those around us that are undergoing trials and difficult situations. And Father, help us to have words of wisdom to share with them, that give them the strength and comfort that Job's friends failed to provide. And please always be with us as we go through times of turmoil and struggle, that we remember you always and remember that you're in control of all things, that we put our hope and our trust in you, and that we rely on your wisdom and on your control, and be able to endure those trials that come our way, and to be refined and to grow stronger for them. Father, we thank you for this example we have in Job, and we thank you for this time to study now together, and help us to be an encouragement to one another. It's in Christ's most precious name we pray. Amen. Thank you. Okay, like I said, probably going to go through this kind of quick, just because I know we're not going to have time to finish today's lesson either. So, but in chapter 13, just kind of a summary of what's going on here. Job continues to point out that his friend's theology is deceitful and false. So if you remember, Zophar. Zophar's speech was provided to Job, and then Job responded to it, and now he's going to go on and give some more of a response. He was talking about how God cannot, systematically be explained as they're trying to do. In chapter 13, he starts to talk about how their own system of thoughts is itself deceitful. He calls his friends worthless doctors in verse 4, and true wisdom would be for them to keep quiet in verse 5. Basically, you don't know what you're talking about. It'd be better off if you weren't speaking. Job calls them out for making up lies to prove their system is true in verse 4, accusing them of basically lying about God and how God operates to prove that you're right, that you're just. And that's a good, important point for us. How often do people take things that are in the Scriptures, and you know the way the outcome is supposed to be, you take what's in the Scriptures and you try to twist it to match your version of events so that you can be proven correct. And that's a very big danger that we have to fight against, to make sure we're not doing that ourselves. Job challenges his three friends, telling them that they're speaking wickedly on God's behalf in verse 7. Verses 8 and 9, how can you defend God's cause, and how well will it go for you if you're going through the same thing? So Job's accusation to them is, you're supposed to be comforting me. If you were in the same situation that I was in, can I make these same accusations against you? Would it be just as bad for you? It'd probably be worse for you. They would be doomed in verse 10 and 11. Their platitudes are ashes and are as fragile as a clay pot in verse 12. The system for explaining life would fall apart when God comes after them. And another reminder to us, when we're a Christian trying to comfort a brother or sister that's going through a trial, those platitudes that we sometimes give, everything's going to be okay and it'll all work out for the better, we just got to be careful how we treat each other, right? Because sometimes that's not the most comforting thing to tell somebody when they've just lost a loved one, to say, it's going to be better. Well, there's truth to that in a heavenly realm, right? But not necessarily here on earth. And we just got to be careful that when we give those words of encouragement, that we're not dismissing the person, but we're actually thinking things through and trying to give them true comfort, and not the clay pots that Job's friends are bringing to him. Verses 13 through 28, in this next section, Job continues to present his case before God. So basically, Job wants to go talk to God and plead his case, and he knows that that's going to be a dangerous thing to do, to go before God and to plead his case, but he doesn't think he has any other choice. He thinks he'd be taking his life into his own hands, verses 13 through 15. but his only hope is to lay out his case before God. And he says God might kill him in verse 15, but that's the only hope he's got. The godless cannot come before God, verse 16. So he knows ungodly people can't come before God, but still Job is leveraging the fact that he considers himself righteous. He's like, I know in my heart that I am righteous, that I have not done some sin against God, so I can lay my hopes on that. And he knows that he will be vindicated in verse 17 through 18. And his friends are also not able to bring a charge against him in verse 19. So even his friends that claim he's a sinner and he must have done something terrible, they can't come up with that thing that he must have done that's sinful. And just again, note that Job continues to have faith in God's righteousness, even though he does not understand what God is doing to him. Finally, verses 20 through 21, Job pleads with God to remove his hand from him because God is terrifying him. Job says that he will call for God if God were to, or he would answer God if God were to call for him, in verse 22. And he knows that he has not done wrong, but he cannot understand why he's God's enemy, in verse 23 through 27. Know that I am a man who is wasting away, in verse 28. So basically, he's still in this hopeless case. So that's a very quick run through of chapter 13. Anybody have a comment on 13 you wanted to talk about before we move on to 14? Because I really wanted to at least not ignore chapter 13. Let me alone, yeah. Yeah. He just wants his friends to be silent at that point. Just be silent. Chapter 14. So there's a couple of points in here that I think are more applicable, or are very applicable for us today, that I just want to make sure we talk about. First of all, Job is going to talk about his hopeless situation again. The days for humans are few and full of trouble, in verse 1. We do not endure, verse 2. Life is short and is fixed by God, verses 3 through 6. So basically, he wants God, just let me alone, leave me alone until it's the time of judgment. Because I can't endure anything else that's going on now. I can't keep enduring this torture that I'm going through. Interesting in verses 7 through 12, he makes an interesting point. Plants and trees have hope when they're cut down, but people don't have the same hope. What do you think that means? How do plants and trees have hope? In verse 7, but humans don't have that same hope. Yeah. Right. Yeah, in his mind, it's all this stuff that's happening to him. When he's dead, it's done. But yet, if he was like a plant was, God could come by and wipe him out and tear him down to the root, and he at least has a hope of coming back. I know there's this weed that's in front of the kid's window at our house, and this thing keeps growing and growing, and it got to I didn't realize it was a weed at first, and it's like a small little tree. It was like an inch in diameter. So I took a saw and I went and I cut the thing down to the ground. I was like, I'm getting rid of this thing. Chopped it down completely. And I went back a little bit later, and what do you know? It's growing again, right? And that's just the way weeds are. But it's like you can't kill it. And that's kind of Job's hope here is I wish I had the hope of a plant, because I know that what I'm going through is unjust. I know that God is going to wipe me out. But at least if I were a plant, I would have hope that I could have this reset with God. And maybe the next time around, things would go better for me. So he wishes he had that hope that the plant has. Plants and trees have hope because when they're cut down, they can sprout again. But humans don't have the same hope. Job wishes that he could have the hope by taking refuge in the grave and then be brought back to life, verses 12 through 13. That's another interesting passage there. It's like if I could just go to the grave and just kind of hide away there until God's wrath has passed, it'd be better for me. Hide me until your anger passes, in verse 13. Let me know how long this is going to go on, and you can remember me again after your wrath is over, verses 13 through 15. Job returns to his hopeless understanding and that renewal must come from this life because we're not like plants are, verses 14 through 17. He cannot be cut down and sprout again. How wonderful it would be if he could start over, be cut down and just start things over again. Verses 16 through 17 is interesting. Because if he could start things over and be cut down and start things over, it would be like his sins could be forgotten. Like you just take all of his sins and put them in a bag and seal them up and throw them away in the trash. And to him, that would be a huge relief. Interesting. Verse 17, my transgression would be sealed up in a bag and would cover over my iniquity, and you would cover over my iniquity. God would basically overlook his sins if that were the case. So again, Job is desiring this really important restored relationship with God. Job thinks that that he has cut off from God because of his suffering. Again, this equation of, well, because I'm suffering, God must not be with me. Yeah, Jan? Yeah. It's interesting. He's basically saying, boy, I wish this resurrection thing could happen, right? I wish I could go down in the grave like the plant, get destroyed, everything get reset, and I could just come back up, and then I would have my relationship with God again, and it would be restored. He wishing that were true. If only there was a resurrection that could fit, like the plants have this hope. If only I could be like the plant and get just wiped out and yet be born again, have this second life to live with God, then maybe things would be better for him.
It's like praying for a sign.
Yeah.
Don't do that today.
Yeah. Yeah, he wants this reset, this great reset with God. Yes?
It's kind of interesting, too, that Job went through all this trials, and he been struggling, he lost his family, and now he's sitting there, and he's full of bored, and scraping himself.
Yep.
And his friends told him,
Yep.
but they're not. They're doing a very poor job saying, you must have done something bad. He said, well, I'll put my place with God.
Yep.
I don't have a problem with that.
Yes.
Maybe God has a problem with me. But he said, see, I can present my case. And I can do my case.
Yeah, his whole attitude the last couple chapters has been, I'm righteous, I know I'm righteous, but God just must not be aware of it. Maybe God doesn't know that I'm righteous. Maybe God is missing something. If only I could just go in front of God and just plead my case to him and show him that I am righteous, he would be like, oh, yeah, Job, you're right. Why am I letting all this happen? I'll fix things for you. Like, that's kind of his attitude. Because again, he has a similar belief to his friends do, that because he's suffering, it must mean God's hand is against him, that God is causing this to happen to him. And if he still had this good relationship with God, none of this bad stuff could be happening. And that's his kind of mistaken belief. But his friends share that belief, but they assume it must be because of sin. But that's what puzzles Job, because he knows he doesn't have a sin that he could, unless it's, again, back to God must be really nitpicking me if he's finding a sin. It's got to be something really tiny. So maybe God is just either nitpicking or he just doesn't realize, or somehow I've fallen through the cracks, right? That's kind of Job's attitude. Anybody else? Finally, in the last part of chapter 14, Job is desiring this restored relationship again. He thinks he's cut off from God, and he's suffering because of that. And then, again, this is a consequence we talked about of this idea of retribution theology. But God has not separated himself from Job, even though Job feels this way. That's an important point. Even though Job thinks God is far from him, God has not separated himself from Job. Job still believes that God would vindicate him if he had the opportunity, but God destroys that hope in him, and that's verses 18 through 22. So the point Job makes is, if there's no resurrection, then I've got no hope. He says that he's going to die, and there's no hope for any kind of restoration, because if I can't get some reset before God, then I'm just going to die, and that's going to be the end of it. Plants and trees have that hope, but Job doesn't have that hope, and that's the problem for him. So that was supposedly the end of last week's lesson. The big application, though, to take from that is considering, I want you to think about what Job is talking about. Without resurrection, there is no hope for humanity. We simply suffer for a few days, and then we die. And he goes on, many of the things he said, our days are few and full of trouble. We are helpless and hopeless in this life. We're like a flower. There's a moment, and then we're burned up. Chapter 14, verses 1 through 2. Humans die and are laid low. We breathe our last, and that's it. Chapter 14, verse 10. Like waters that dry up, so we lie down and do not awake. Chapter 14, verses 11 through 12. So again, this idea that if there's no restoration, if there's no resurrection, then that's the end. Where we just have a few miserable days on earth and then it's over. And that is a big cause of hopelessness, right? If we don't know of this resurrection, if there's no resurrection, then it's a hopeless case for people. Life is truly painful and pitiful. And we see in the scriptures that Job's feelings are correct, that without the hope, are correct if there is no hope of resurrection. Just finish me off and let me die when I'm in this anguish. Well, that's Job's kind of attitude. And we see the same point made in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 19. Paul says to the Corinthians, if in Christ we have hope in this life only, we are of all people most to be pitied. Like if our hope is just in this life, then Christians are especially to be pitied because, again, we learn that we're going to suffer and we're going to face persecution in this life. So if our hope is just for this life, we're going to be especially disadvantaged, right? We're going to be especially pitied. But God, again, addresses our need. It gives us hope. And again, this is back to talking about the resurrection. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 3 through 9. Let me see if I can read that real quick. 1 Peter chapter 1 and verses 3 through 9. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. According to his great mercy, he has caused us to be born again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, to an inheritance that is imperishable, undefiled, and unfading, kept in heaven for you, who by God's power are being guarded through faith for a salvation ready to be revealed in the last time. In this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor to the revelation of Jesus Christ. Though you have not seen him, you love him. Though you do not now see him, you believe in him and rejoice with joy that is inexpressible and filled with glory, obtaining the outcome of your faith, the salvation of your souls. So again, this is the hope that Job is begging for, right? That Job doesn't see, because he sees himself, I wish I could be like that plant that got chopped down and could grow back, but I don't have that hope. And again, for us today, if we don't have that relationship with Christ, we don't have that hope. But it's through Christ and his resurrection that we do have hope. Any other comments on that? Yeah. 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 Yeah, we don't really want to be like plants. That's true. Yeah. Okay. Anybody else want to have any comments on chapter 14 before we move on? I wanted to make sure we talked about that because that's kind of an important point that Job realizes that is equally applicable to us. Okay. So that takes us to today's lesson. Job chapter 15. If I can find my way back there. So his friends, again, Job's friends have all come to comfort him. And they have sat down and they've stayed with him 7 days in his quietness and give him some comfort. And then they start speaking to him. Well, Job first speaks and tells about his situation. So they want to offer him words of comfort. But instead they kind of make these accusations against Job. And they're really not being very helpful to him. So we've seen all three of his friends. We've got Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar have gone through one cycle of speeches. And now we're going to see that's going to repeat. There's going to be a second cycle of speeches. And that's where we're starting today in chapter 15. So we see Eliphaz's second speech to Job. All three of his friends, have come to comfort him. They've tried to comfort him by trying to explain why they think Job is suffering. So they know why Job is suffering, and they're going to explain it to him. Their conclusion, Job, you must have sinned. Sin's the only reason that you could be suffering the way you are. That's their accusation. But again, first two chapters of Job tell us that Job has not sinned, that he's righteous and upright. So we know that accusation is false. Though the friends have tried to cause Job to admit his guilt, Job continues to remain resolute that he has not sinned. Unfortunately, though, for Job, his friends don't seem to want to leave him alone. He just wants them to leave him alone at this point. But they still have these words of quote-unquote wisdom they want to impart to him. So that's where the second cycle of speeches starts. So let's look at Job chapter 15, and we're going to read part of the speech here. So I'm going to read the first 6 verses. Job chapter 15, verses 1 through 6. Then Eliphaz the Temanite answered and said, should a wise man answer with windy knowledge and fill his belly with the east wind? Should he argue in unprofitable talk or in words with which he can do no good? But you are doing away with the fear of God and hindering meditation before God. For your iniquity teaches your mouth, and you choose the tongue of the crafty. Your own mouth condemns you, and not I. Your own lips testify against you. So what's Eliphaz's words of comfort to Job here? Not much, right? In verse 2, he calls him a windbag again, right? Yep. You're just a hot air, hot wind. Yeah. Right. They're going to keep hanging themselves on that argument. I haven't seen innocent people suffer. So Job, you must be guilty. Verse 2, back to, they came originally with this polite attitude. Are they still being polite towards Job? The politeness is pretty much gone at this point. Eliphaz is that politeness has completely disappeared. He says a wise man would not speak with such empty talk, yet again calling Job a windbag. Eliphaz declares that wise do not engage in such empty chatter. Like basically all you're speaking is nonsense. And if you were really wise like we are, you wouldn't be saying such thing. Job's attempts to argue his case have no value. Your words are useless. Not only this, Eliphaz says that what Job is saying undermines the fear of God, directing people to challenge God and no longer pray. Verse 4. He's basically saying what you're saying, Job, is teaching people the wrong thing about God and telling them it's no point praying to God. And you're being a challenge, you're challenging who God is. So not only are you doing bad things for yourself, you're doing bad things for everybody, right? Your example is going to cause other people to sin and have problems. Your words are detrimental to those who seek to live faithfully. Your sin is what causes your mouth to speak, and your tongue is misleading. Verse 5. So basically, Job, it's only because of your sin that's making you say these things. You're so desperate to protect yourself that you're trying to say these things. Your own mouth condemns you and shows that you are not blameless. Verse 6. So what words has Job said that condemn him and show him to be blameless? Show that he is not blameless. What's their argument? What's Eliphaz's argument? What words does he point to of Job? Yeah, he really doesn't point to anything. Job still says he's righteous. That's about the only thing that you could hang it on. Just because, Job, you say you're righteous, and I know that can't be true, because I know how God operates, and I know how God does things, therefore, your own words are condemning you. That's his whole attitude. Excuse me.
Well, it takes me back to verse 15 in chapter 13. It says, though he slay me, yet will I trust in him, but I will maintain mine own ways before him.
Yeah.
So he's really defending that he's not done anything wrong.
Yeah, as far as Job knows, he's done nothing wrong, and he's going to defend himself. He's like, I know my ways are correct, or at least I have not sinned, so I'm going to argue the same thing to God. Anybody else? Yeah, the speech would have been a little better delivered to the mirror because he's pretty much condemning himself with what he's saying. And that's very true. The accusations his friends are making against him are often very, they're very much a projection of their own attitudes, right? Almost a confession to what they're thinking. Yeah. So before we move forward, just some things to think about. about this kind of character that they're talking about. Job was blameless and upright, and the only thing the friends can say is that Job's words condemn him. But Job's words only condemn him because he's not saying what his friends want him to say. That's the argument that they're providing. His words condemn him because he's not saying what his friends want him to say. So move forward in history. Now think about the time of Jesus. How was Jesus treated? What was Jesus' righteousness level, right? Similar to Job, better than Job, Jesus was blameless, upright, sinless, and for Jesus at least, he was perfect. And yet, what did people accuse him of? Blasphemy. They accused him of his words were condemning him. His very words that he was saying were the charge against him. But did Jesus say anything that was wrong? No, he did not. Rather, Jesus' words were charged against him because he did not say what the Jewish leaders wanted him to say. Matthew 26:65. So again, very similar to how Job is being treated here. And a good reminder to us when we're talking with someone else. Just because someone doesn't agree with us doesn't make their words wrong. We should think about our words and how we're treating them and whether our words come from the scriptures or not. We shouldn't be making those kind of charges against people unless, again, they're contrary to the scriptures. But just in Job's case, just in Jesus' case, they weren't saying the right things to the people around them, and because of that, they were condemned by the people around them. Okay, let's see. Let's move on in the second passage, 7 through 16. So picking up in verse 7. Are you the first man who was born, or were you brought forth before the hills? Have you listened in the counsel of God, and do you limit wisdom to yourself? What do you know that we do not know? What do you understand that is not clear to us? Both the gray-haired and the aged among us, older than your father, are the comforts of God too small for you, or the word that deals gently with you? Why does your heart carry you away, and why do your eyes flash? That you turn your spirit against God and bring such words out of your mouth. What is man that he can be pure, or he who is born of a woman that he can be righteous? Behold, God puts no trust in his holy ones, and the heavens are not pure in his sight. How much less one who is abominable and corrupt, a man who drinks injustice like water? Interesting. So what does Eliphaz think about Job's wisdom? He's scoffing at it for sure. He's definitely judging him. He asked Job, do you have some kind of inside track on wisdom that none of us have? Right? What about your wisdom is so special? Do you have a monopoly on wisdom? But Job has never claimed that to his friends. Job has merely questioned the wisdom of his friends. And they are misrepresenting Job and misrepresenting God. Again, because Job's wisdom doesn't align to their wisdom, then Job must be wrong. Eliphaz says that Job is fighting against the wisdom of the ages. All the old people, the gray-haired people, they know, and you're disagreeing with them. How dare you? His point's very simple. The old people are wise. Job's ideas are wrong because that is not what their forefathers believed in verses 9 through 10. So again, this is what everybody believes, Job, and you don't agree, you must be wrong. The three friends may be aged, but they do not have godly wisdom with them, and Job recognizes that. So again, there's a connection there. Just because you're an older person or more elderly, you probably have more wisdom than someone that's younger, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's godly wisdom. And that's the careful point to make, is when we're sharing our wisdom with others, we got to make sure that it's godly wisdom to start with. Any other thoughts on that? Yeah. Yeah, even today, you see everybody wants you to follow the wisdom of popular culture, and even that's not elderly wisdom, right? That's new and novel wisdom. And we know that's not godly wisdom as well. But Eliphaz thinks he has God's wisdom, verses 11 through 13. He calls his words to Job the comforts of God. How nice, right? I'm just giving you comfort from God, Job. Why are you being so contrary? Why are you, he gets agitated that Job doesn't want that comfort. It's like, Job, I've given you God's wisdom and you're not happy about it. What's wrong with you? Amazingly, Eliphaz says that their words have been gentle words to Job, verse 11. We're telling you such gentle and easy things. Calling you a windbag and calling you evil and everything else. Like, we're just being so gentle with you, and yet you're refusing to hear us. Because Job does not accept their words, Job's heart has carried him away, and his spirit has turned against God. Because you reject us, you're obviously rejecting God, is their attitude. But instead, let's see. Now we have listened to the words of Job, and we have not seen evidence that Job's spirit has turned away from God. Again, what's Job's attitude toward God been the whole time? Has he turned his back on God? No, he hasn't. And again, he doesn't understand why he's going through this, but he trusts that God is ultimately right, and he, again, trusts in his own righteousness. He says, if I could just plead my case before God, then God would fix it. Yeah. Yeah, he still has trust in God. He still thinks God will vindicate him. Job is pleading for his relationship to return. That's the thing he's upset about, is why is my relationship with God not what it should be? Job desires to be renewed by God so that they can enjoy a new relationship, verses 12 through 14. But Eliphaz continues to try to show that Job is sinful, verses 14 through 16. Eliphaz restates a prior argument that no one can be pure before God. That's something he said before. That's verses 17 through 19. But he's clearly pointing his finger at Job, calling him one who is abominable and corrupt, drinking injustice like water. Words of comfort, right, from his friends. And again, his friends could be pointing out something against him that is valid, but they should be able to explain to him what it is. But instead, they just know there's something there, and they don't know what it is. So he must be drinking injustice like water. Really bad. Again, this is poetic poetry, right? We're reading poetry here, and it's supposed to, really bring the point home. I think, and it does. Their attitude is completely against Job at this point. Let's see, picking up in verse 17, we'll read the rest of his speech here. Job chapter 15, starting verse 17. I will show you, hear me, and what I have seen I will declare. What wise men have told without hiding it from their fathers, to whom alone the land was given, and no stranger passed among them. The wicked man writhes in pain all his days, through all the years that are laid up for the ruthless. Dreadful sounds are in his ears. In prosperity the destroyer will come upon him. He does not believe that he will return out of darkness, and he is marked for the sword. He wanders abroad for bread, saying, where is it? He knows that a day of darkness is ready at his hand. Distress and anguish terrify him. They prevail against him like a king ready for battle, because he has stretched out his hand against God and defies the Almighty, running stubbornly against him with a thick-bossed shield, because he has covered his face with his fat and gathered fat upon his waist, and has lived in desolate cities, in houses that none should inhabit, which are ready to become heaps of ruins. He will not be rich, and his wealth will not endure, nor will his possessions spread over the earth. He will not depart from darkness. The flame will dry up his shoots, and by the breath of his mouth he will depart. Let him not trust in emptiness, deceiving himself, for emptiness will be his payment. It will be paid in full before his time, and the branch will not be green. He will shake off his unripe grape like the vine, and cast off his blossom like the olive tree. For the company of the godless is barren. The fire consumes the tents of bribery. They conceive trouble and give birth to evil, and their womb prepares deceit. All right. So this is the end of Eliphaz's argument, and he ends it by telling Job that he's going to give him some more words of wisdom here, some more wise words in verse 17 through 19. So what's the wisdom that Eliphaz finishes up here with?
Sounds like he's telling him he just doesn't have a chance.
Yeah. He starts talking about describing the condition of the wicked. He talks about how the wicked man suffers torment. Again, this is all the stuff that he's seen. I know wicked people suffer torment. Wealth and power offer no escape from these terrors in verse 20. So wicked are not going to be profitable. The wicked are hopeless and distressed, verses 21 through 24. The wicked are stubborn against God, verses 25 through 26, and blinded by their wealth, 27 through 30. The wicked who hide behind their wealth lose their wealth, verses 29 through 31. So is that true? Certainly. Yeah. I mean, the attitude again here is back to this retribution theology idea, is that, well, these wicked people, they're going to get what they're going to get what they deserve, and God's going to make sure that they don't prosper. So again, if they're wealthy, well, then of course that's not going to endure. And we do know that wicked people will get justice that's coming to them, right? But there's a difference between what happens on this world versus God's wisdom and how God runs His creation. Yeah. He doesn't. I don't think there's a direct evidence of that, but I got the same feeling. Is that there's a bit of this haughty pride, like, well, Job, at least I'm not like you are. And maybe before he was a little jealous of Job. Look at how great Job is, and I'm trying to do the right thing, right? And back to his philosophy is, the more righteous you are, the more God will prosper you. So if Job had more than he had before, we don't know if he did or not, but if Job was doing better than he had, wouldn't that make him a little bit envious? Like, well, why is God not treating me as good as he is Job? Maybe there's something that I've done wrong, or that I'm not, and now he sees Job crashing down. He's like, oh, well, of course I've always been better than Job, but Job's now getting what he deserves. Again, that's just my speculation, but I do get that read from it. And certainly there's a danger in us having that attitude toward other people, right? When we see somebody who's rich and wealthy and has everything they want, we think, man, that's just not right. Like, I wish I could be like that, or I wish I had all that. And again, the idea that society would tell you is, well, that's just because God's not blessing you. Like, he likes that person better, right? That's the whole point. And when we see that person fall, we're like, oh, well, that feels good, right? And that's not a good attitude to have, for sure. Because again, we're not promised those things on this earth. All right, anybody else? Okay. So notice Eliphaz is clearly putting Job in the category of the wicked. Your wealth is not a sign of divine blessing. Rather, Job is the wicked wealthy who's wiped out by God. And I think that's exactly the point. He's putting Job in that category. Verse 30, Eliphaz uses Job's words about the shoots and the trees. So he starts using Job's own words against him. Job's longing, I wish I was like a plant that could be cut down and grow back. He uses his words against him, saying that the shoots of a tree will sprout again after being cut down. But Eliphaz tells Job that God will burn up those shoots. So that wicked ruler, he might have that good thing happen to him, but God's going to still cut him down again. Eliphaz tells Job that God will burn up his shoots. Suffering is not inevitable to humans, but divinely instituted discipline for sin. That's Eliphaz's idea. You don't suffer unless you've sinned, and that's God's punishing you. And humans are full of wickedness, and Job is a deceitful man, so everything makes sense to me. I understand the universe, I understand how God works, and I can go on with my life being happy. That's Eliphaz's whole attitude. And again, he's misrepresenting how God operates. So does God use suffering to bring people back to him? Absolutely true. We see that in the scriptures. Yes, we see that, and we're going to see that later in Job. We see this truth made in the New Testament, that trials refine our faith, but the error is assuming that all suffering is divinely instituted discipline for sin. And that's obviously not true. We're not to draw such a conclusion. Suffering and loss do not mean that God is disciplining you, as illustrated by the lives of Job, Joseph, the prophets, Jesus, the apostles, and countless examples in the Bible to show us that suffering is not because of sin, necessarily because of sin. You can't look at a person or a group of people. You can't look at a nation. You can't look at any block of people and say the reason they're suffering is because God is disciplining them. And that the way that God runs the world is just not that simple. And again, that's something that comes to us today, right? We see how society reacts and how society treats God, and we see a country undergoing strife and turmoil or a war or some terrible situation. Like, God must be judging those people, must be destroying those people because they've turned their back on him. We see even our own country. Look at how great things were, back after World War II and all the success and great things that our nation has gone through. It must be because we were doing so much of what God wanted and we were so righteous, right? And then now we're all the things that we see in the news and where we're not following God, well, God's going to come judge us. There's some truth to our actions and attitudes affect what happens to us. But again, God's not quite that simple in the way he runs the world. He has greater purposes in mind. And it's just a reminder for us that just because we see one person suffering, a group of people suffering, a race of people suffering, a country suffering, doesn't mean that God is punishing them. And just because we see the opposite prospering, doesn't mean it's because they're especially righteous and they're treating God well. We just want to remember that point. Okay, any other comments on chapter 15? So I'd like to get to Job's response, but obviously we don't have time today to go through that, which was expected because we finished up last week. So we will go through that next week, chapters 16 and 17. And if we have time, we'll try to do at least Bildad's speech next week and Job's response. I'm not sure that we'll be able to get that far, but that'll be the hope. So go ahead and finish up chapter 16 and 17, and then if you can, read 18 and 19.